It's about a month ago now that Kevin Smith and some of his disciples were arrested in Montego Bay after people were murdered by the sect, well, let's call it a cult, of which Kevin Smith was the head. And I think it's good for us to think about what it is that enables those kinds of organizations to have the effect that they do, but also what we might do for ourselves and for our children to help people not to be sucked in by these kinds of organizations in the future. It won't surprise you that I don't think there's any silver bullet here. There's not one single thing that you can do to ensure you don't fall into the clutches of a cult. And even actually defining exactly what you mean by a cult can be quite contentious. Some people will think of certain parts within the Catholic Church as cult-ish, at least. But there are certainly characteristics that we can look out for, and I think there are aspects of our lives that we can pay attention to that make it harder for a cult to get its grip on us. So firstly, where do we get our ideas about life from? What is the source of our ideas about life? I think lots of people in Jamaica might, as a first answer, go for something like the Bible. And I think the Bible is a great answer. I think if the members of Kevin Smith's organization had paid attention to the Bible, they couldn't have done what they did. And I certainly think Christians, of course, place the Bible in a very high place. We think of the Bible as an inspired witness to Jesus Christ, first of all, right? That's what it is. It's an inspired witness to Jesus Christ. But we also know from the text of the Bible itself that actually reading it can be rather hard. St. Peter says in his letters that there are all sorts of people who find it difficult to read the letters of St. Paul. So even in his own day, St. Paul was rather hard to understand. And what's the solution to that? Well, studying the Bible is a task. It isn't something that you can just pick up and read well right away. I think some people make the mistake of thinking you can just open the Bible and make sense of it. That isn't the case. It's a hard book to read. It's a difficult book to make sense of. But nevertheless, it's very, very important for us Christians. St. Jerome, of course, told us that ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. It's a very important saying. But Scripture on its own cannot be the whole story. In the Catholic Church, in the first place, we add alongside Scripture what we call tradition, which really is just a word for the life of the Church, the ongoing life of the Church. St. Paul tells us in his letters that he is handing on to us what he himself first received. And it's actually from the Latin word for to hand on that we get the word tradition. So St. Paul hands on what he had himself received. And we in the Catholic Church and in the other Christian churches, perhaps to a more limited degree, hand on what St. Paul and the other apostles have handed on to us, and which they themselves received from Jesus himself. But again, that isn't the whole story for us Catholics. We think that alongside Scripture and tradition, we have to use our minds. We have to use our brains. We have to be intelligent. We can't just think that we can sit in the pew on a Sunday and listen to what Father says, and he will explain it all to me. You have to use your own mind God has given you an intelligence to think about the world around you. And actually, one of the ways in which we show that intelligence is by engaging with what's told us by other people. And one of the most important ways in which we do that is by talking about it to other people. So one of the things that the experts tell us that cults do is they cut people off from family and friends. And that makes it hard for them to check the things that they're being told in a cult. If someone tells you something strange, the most natural and important thing to do is to talk about it. Ask your friends, what do you think of this? Have you ever thought about this idea? Does it make any sense to you? It's one of the ways in which we avoid falling into believing things which are simply crazy, and especially if we are able to ask people who have some kind of skill, some kind of expertise, some kind of study in the field that is in question. So if you want to know about the climate, you don't ask somebody who knows nothing about climate science. You ask people who have some kind of expertise. And if you want to know about religious claims, talk to somebody who studied these things a bit. I don't necessarily mean a priest. We don't necessarily know everything. But there are lots of people who have done some study, have done some work in coming to understand these things, and it makes sense to ask about these things to other people. The second thing that cults do, and it sort of relates to this idea of isolating people so that they don't ask questions, is that they first of all show great affection to new members. Sometimes this is called love bombing. People are shown an enormous amount of attention and affection. And that's important. There's nothing wrong with receiving affection from people, being shown some kind of interest in you. That's an important thing. All of us need that in our lives. We need people who care for us. But what happens, unfortunately, with an organization like Kevin Smith's is people get sucked in by this love bombing, by this attention that they get within the cult, and then it becomes very difficult to leave. They've been cut off from family and friends, as I said already, and then if they leave the group, very often a group like that will cut you dead. All of these people who were your friends a moment ago are suddenly people who do not want to know you. And of course, you only have to see that happen to one or two people around you, and it becomes a strong disincentive to give up on the cult. And the third thing that happens, I think, is that people become emotionally attached to a group that they have spent a lot of energy and even money in being involved in. If you pour a lot of your time and energy and even money into an organization, it actually becomes hard at a certain point for you to say, this organization is mistaken. I've made a mistake. I shouldn't have joined it in the first place. Now, what's going on with all that second and that third movement? Well, I think what happens is people very often, and you see this in everybody's religious life. I mean, every single one of us is a little bit prone to this. We get carried away by our emotions, by how we feel about things. Emotions can be helpful. They can be enormously helpful. When you feel tenderly about the people around you, that can help you to act well towards them. But think about the fact that it's more important that you act well than that you have a certain feeling in your heart. The tender feelings are nice when we have them. They help us. They help us when what we're doing is actually loving. But the actual loving involves caring for people, looking after people, making sure people are well and healthy and not being sacrificed to a cult, for example. So emotions can be good when they help us to love, but actually they can also be bad when they get in the way of us loving the people we have duties towards. Think about someone who is a married man and falls in love with another woman. The emotions for the other woman actually get in the way of him being loving. They get in the way of him acting in a loving way towards his wife and his children to whom he has duties, right? So emotions can help us when we're doing something loving and they prompt us to do those things, but they can also be in the way. So we must never think that how we feel about something is enough. We need to ground what we do, not just in how we feel, but also in something we say objective. What we mean is outside of ourselves. In this case, I've talked about 3 really important parts of that. The scriptures, the revelation about Jesus Christ. Tradition, the tradition of the church, the life of the church. That's part of the reason the church commands us to get to Mass on a Sunday. Not at the moment because of COVID, but ordinarily to get to Mass on a Sunday. It's not because the church wants some enormous box-ticking exercise where we do all these things that we're meant to be doing. But the church, as a good mother, knows this is good for us. Joining in the life of the church helps to feed us with helpful and important ideas that sustain us. And we need to use our brains and think. And part of thinking is about talking, asking questions, speaking to people who know something about what we are talking about. None of this is absolutely going to keep us away from occasionally falling into foolishness. But I hope it will help us to avoid it in the first place, but also help us to get out once we realize that things are not as they first appear. Don't rely on the way that you feel. Look to something outside of yourself. Look to scripture and tradition and reason.